my name is Sarah, as Fiona said, and I love SVG. This pretty much says a lot. So how do I start this? I want to start this with a disclaimer first. I also love CSS. I've even written a CSS reference for code drops, if you're familiar with it. But there's going to be a lot of CSS versus SVG stuff in my talk, so I wanted to give this disclaimer first, just so you don't think that I hate SVG, okay, or have anything against it. But throughout this talk, I want to show you how you can use SVG, or how SVG provides us with better alternatives to common approaches that we usually take when creating or doing stuff using CSS or HTML5 canvas, for example. So there's going to be a lot of Use SVG slides. Okay? Now, so if by the end of the talk you feel like you want to go out and start using SVG more, then I will have accomplished everything that I'm here for today. Now, there are many reasons why you should be using SVG. The number one reason is SVG is awesome. Really. I mean, this pretty much sums it up. But I think that everyone here is familiar with how it's scalable, resolution independent. There are not infinite, but the number of tools for creating, animating, spriting SVGs is becoming much more especially during the past year with all of the attention that SVG has been getting. Browser support is really good. If you care about IE8 and below, which do not support SVG, you have a lot of fallback techniques that you can use. So there is really no excuse why you wouldn't be using SVG today. So before I move on, how many of you do use SVG in production and real-life projects today? Oh, that's a lot. Awesome. Okay, I was kind of hoping that I would have to convince you more. So, since you already do use SVG, I'm hoping that, okay, maybe then you will find some new use cases or examples where you would want to use it more. So I know from my conversations over Twitter, I know that a lot of people avoid using SVG or refrain from using it for icon systems, for example, or for any other use cases because of the nature of SVG, because it's an image format and it's also a document, it has the advantages and limitations of an image format and the advantages and limitations of a document. So it can get sometimes really messy, but it's not really messy. It's just that you're going to have so many options, so many things that you can choose from, that can become overwhelming. And a lot of developers are like, what the heck, I don't want to even think about it. So I know that a lot of developers still use icon fonts. By the way, I hate icon fonts. They still use icon fonts just because it's easier. Someone told me that on Twitter. They don't want to have to worry about providing fallback for IE8. That's the only reason. Well, I'm going to talk about icon fonts more later in the talk. But, you know, the number two reason why you should be using SVG today is to push SVG forward. Like right now, I'm trying to convince you to use it, but you already do. Okay, so pushing SVG forward. Like I said, a lot of developers refrain from using it because there are a lot of features that are missing right now. But you see, SVG is getting much better. SVG Level 2 already has a lot of improvements and additional features that are not available in SVG 1, like Z-index, which is something we really miss, considering that everything in an SVG is positioned absolutely. We really need Z-index. So we're going to get that in SVG 2. We're going to get more attributes that we can animate and change using CSS. So it's getting better. But if there's anything, any limitation, any reason why you're not using SVG, maybe you should just use it, and spec editors usually listen. They always listen. If you have a feature request, it can easily, if you provide them with a practical use case, it can easily turn into a specification. The specification is going to be implemented at some point. You're going to feel very happy, and you're going to make others in the community really happy. An example of this, actually, a while back, I was working on some client work. My client requested that the SVG would change on different screen sizes. Okay, so the first thing that came to my mind was to use the viewbox attribute, because the viewbox allows you to specify which parts of the SVG you want to show. Okay, so my first idea was to use the viewbox in order to just change the value of the viewbox, the range, the size, whatever, on different screen sizes, and you've got art direction in SVG. But since we cannot do that in CSS, I had to use JavaScript, and then it got a little messy because my client requested other things, so I ended up giving it up. I asked the spec editor whether or not it would be possible to have a viewbox property in CSS, so he told me that send the proposal to the SVG working group, send them your working, not working, it's not going to be working because it's not implemented, but send them a use case, a practical use case, and it might turn into a specification, and you're going to end up with whatever you want. Now, there are some limitations in SVG. I'm not going to get into them because those are not the subject of the talk, but if you have any requests, talk to the spec editors, pester them, but not really too much, okay? And don't tell them I said that. CSS or SVG. So I want to start with a comparison between CSS and SVG methods. We use CSS a lot of times to create certain things, but SVG provides us with a much better alternative. It's much better, much more semantic, accessible, as you're going to see. So a while back, I saw a tweet by Fantasai. How do you pronounce it? Like that, okay, Fantasai. So he tweeted something. He had overheard someone say, people end up making graphics with CSS instead of SVG because for many use cases, it offers them more flexibility, which is absurd. Now, I'm still confused about this tweet. I don't know if whoever said that, did they mean that it's absurd that CSS provides more flexibility because they think that SVG is more flexible? Or is it that CSS does indeed provide them more flexibility, which is absurd because SVG should be providing them with more? I'm not making any sense, but then again, I'm still confused by it. But no matter what they meant, whichever case it is, fact remains that there are some situations where CSS does indeed provide us with more flexibility than SVG, and where you should be, and where I personally usually recommend using CSS. The number one example that I can think about is CSS animations versus SVG animations, or AKA SMIL. SMIL can become a real pain in the neck. If you're going to animate the SVG, animate the transformations inside an SVG, it can become really messy. If you want to really know how messy it gets, try it yourself, but you're going to hate me, so maybe you don't want to do it. If CSS animations are more flexible, if you have multiple transformation animations that are applying, it's going to be much simpler and easier using CSS. But okay, generally speaking, this is a side note. If you're going to animate SVGs, transformations, whatever, I usually recommend using JavaScript because CSS animations, transformations on SVG are still very much buggy in many browsers. They're not supported in IE. SMIL is not supported in IE at all and might be pulled out of Blink. So if you have some serious animation work, I recommend using a JavaScript library. Okay, so the first example I want to go over that we usually use CSS for, or some of us use CSS to do, and we shouldn't be using it, is creating CSS-only images, like CSS-only Mona Lisas or CSS-only whatever. I know it is for fun. A lot of people do it for fun, but I also know that some people do it for actual production work. And the only thing that I can think about when someone says CSS-only images is this. This says it all. I'm not going to comment more. So SVG is an image format. If you're going to create an image, use SVG. If it's all about challenging yourself and improving your CSS skills or your coding skills in general, then maybe try creating SVG path syntax manually instead of using a graphics editor. Now, that would be an amazing challenge if it's all just about challenging yourself. Now, and then there's this thing called CSS shapes, which are basically just shapes, also created using CSS. Some people do it for fun, which is perfectly fine, and some people do it for actual productions. But why would you want to do that? I mean, the heart shape on the left, it is true that the code in here is bloated because it's old and has a lot of WebKit prefixes that are no longer needed. But if you look at the heart shape on the left using CSS, and the first SVG on top, I mean, SVG is an image. It's an actual shape. You're drawing a shape using an SVG path. It's more semantic. It's more accessible. This is how it should be done. Okay, and SVG comes with a lot of other elements for creating all kinds of different shapes. You have paths for creating arbitrarily shaped shapes, and you have circles, polygons, rectangles, and much, much more. And what the most important part here is that the CSS shapes are not real content, they're fake content. They're usually a div or whatever, a non-semantic element just thrown in the markup, and you just style it into some certain shape. But SVG shapes are real content. So if you need something like this, do this. Use SVG. This is the first one. Now, since SVG is better equipped for creating arbitrarily shaped elements in general, it only makes sense that it is better equipped for creating arbitrarily shaped UI components. And the first example that I can think about is creating radial menus. Radial menus are more popular than I ever thought because a little over a year, I wrote an article for CodeDrops where I explained how to create radial menus using CSS only. It is very hacky. Now, this technique was generally thought of by Anna Tudor, and I just wrote the article explaining how you can do it. So this is basically how you do it. You have a set of elements inside your navigation. You skew the elements, and then you rotate them, and then you unskew the content inside of them. You're still not getting that sector shape. So in order to fake that sector shape, you make the just like you see here, the container is made into a circle, and the overflow is cut, and you end up with something that looks like a radial menu, but it's not really a radial menu. Okay? However, if you're going to do it with SVG, it's going to be much more different and much more semantic. In order to create a sector in SVG, we need 3 points, lined from the first to the other, arc to the third, and you just close the sector and you're done. This is all you need. The sector is an actual sector, it's an element, and if you need many more elements, you just add as many as you need and then you rotate them, and that's all you need. Pointer events work here as expected. With CSS, it's so buggy. When I created the examples for the Coderops article, all of the examples worked, even in IE9 and above, but when I tried them a while back, when I was preparing for this talk, it didn't work in Chrome, and I have no idea why. So it's really buggy. If you're going to create some UI components that are not rectangular, don't try to bend the box model and try to make it do what it's not meant to do, and use SVG instead. Definitely use SVG. Now, there is one thing, creating this sector and SVG is really simple because, drawing a line is simple, even if you're going to do it manually. I literally did it manually here. The arc can be drawn also very simple. All you need is the angle and the radius of the circle, and you're set. But where it can get a little tedious is when you have to add the icons to the circle and position the icons. So in order to make it easier for me, because I'm kind of lazy when it comes to these things, and to others, I created this tool which is called circulus.svg, which allows you to create radial menus. You have a lot of options, even 2 styles you can choose from. You can add gaps, not add gaps. It's going to generate the SVG code for you. Even everything's going to be ready for the icons you want to add. It's a GUI, basically. Okay, styling form elements. Another example where SVG provides us with something that CSS cannot. Let's start with checkboxes. In order to style a checkbox in SVG, in CSS, we have actually 2 ways. The first one is using, you don't have to use any image sprites in the first one. Basically, you have the label without any text, and then you style the background using radial gradients, etc. But I usually prefer having text in the label. So this is the second technique where you just hide the checkbox. Everyone's familiar with how to style a checkbox, right? Oh, no. OK, that's good. At least I have something to explain. So you have a checkbox, the actual checkbox that is being rendered. You set the display to none. You want to hide it. And then you apply a background image to the label. Okay, so the background image is usually a sprite, like the one shown above here. It contains the checked and unchecked styles of the checkbox that you want to style. And then you can either use JavaScript to handle the click events or the checked pseudo class in CSS. Basically, you have the first non-checked style applied as a background image, and then just like you would do with any other sprite, when the checkbox is checked, just change the position of the background image, and you're going to get the styled style. Okay? However, this works. It does work, but you're not going to get any animation. You're just going to get an image that changes when the checkbox is checked. But if you want to achieve something like this, this is much better, right? You're getting, the user is getting a much better feedback. It feels more natural. So to do this, you're not going to be able to do it in CSS, but you can do it in SVG. And it has a few advantages. So in order to do it in SVG, first of all, you're not going to need any image sprite. So this saves an extra HTTP request. And generally speaking, when you're going to style checkboxes or elements so small, the SVG used is going to be really small. So inlining it and putting it inside the HTML is not going to be any problem. So you would just add the SVG inside the label, as shown in the example above. First, there's this line drawing technique. Again, how many of you are familiar with the line drawing technique? Okay. So the line drawing technique, how does it work? When I was rehearsing the talk, I thought about explaining it by using spaghetti, but I don't have any access to spaghetti. So you have a path, whatever, this shape that you can see in front of you, just a scribble or whatever. And what you do is there's a property in SVG that's called stroke-offset that allows you to, it's kind of like pulling the path out of its position. Okay, so you pull it out so that it's not visible anymore, and then when you check the checkbox, you pull it back in, and it looks like it's being drawn. So, okay, do we have internet connection? Okay, it's not necessary, no problem. I'm gonna go over it again shortly. So using this technique, the line drawing technique, you can create so many other effects. This is again from an article on CodeDrops. You see, the way you draw the checkbox, not only first we saved an extra HTTP request, we have an actual image, we get the animation interactions which you don't get with CSS, and it's just much better. Okay, now the line drawing technique, I first read about it, I think the first article that ever mentioned it was this article by Jake Archibald. If you're interested in learning more about it, I totally recommend this article because he has an interactive demo which shows you exactly how it works, so you get to see exactly how it works. Okay, in addition to styling checkboxes with SVG, you can style other form elements like these, again from CodeDrops. I really like the way, you see how the way the line moves in a wave and then pushes the label upwards. This kind of expression cannot be done using CSS for now. Maybe we may be able to do it at some point. But this is doable in SVG because these are SVG paths. This line is an SVG path. In SVG, you can animate a path. You basically have a shape, and you animate it from the initial shape to the other shape. Okay, and the animation from one shape to the other is going to give you effects like these and much more complex effects that allow us to create just amazing UIs. Yesterday Eva talked about timing functions, and a lot of people love using, I'm one of those people, I love abusing elastic timing functions because they sometimes give that extra feel to the UI, making it a little more realistic. So if you add a visual elastic effect like this, it's going to make it even much more realistic and much more amusing and better. Okay, I lack the English word for this. Okay. Graphical text effects. This is one of my favorite things that you can do with SVG. A long time ago, how many of you used the alt CSS way? Basically, you have a heading, text, and you hide it using the 9999 pixels padding, and then Scott Cullum saved us from that, and by using the 100% text indentation. How many of you used it? Okay. So basically what we're doing here is we have a heading, a text, and because we want it to be fancy and apply some kind of graphical effect to it, and we couldn't do it any other way, so what we did was we hid the text by pushing it far, far, far away at first, and then applied a background image to the text, to the box of the text that is being rendered, and that background image would be the same text but having a graphical effect, and we would usually get it from Photoshop or something. Now, the newer CSS way to apply fill to text is, this is really faking a fill to text. We have background clip and text fill color, and these only work in WebKit, so I wouldn't use these in production. And again, we're only faking applying a fill to text. Using this technique, these two properties, what we're doing here is we have a piece of text. This is a block text, a block font here. That's why it's so thick and helps achieve this really nice effect depending on what you're doing. So we have a text, you turn it into a transparent, and then you clip the background to the shape of that text so that it looks like it has a fill applied to it, but it doesn't really have any fill applied. The other way that we can use in CSS now is using CSS masks. Using CSS masks, we can use an image, no matter what that image is, and then apply it as a mask to text, but that only allows us to end up with something like, not exactly like this, but you're applying texture to text, changing the texture. You're not really applying any fills to text. With SVG, we have the ability to clip background to text too, but we also have much better ways and much more semantic alternatives. This is an SVG code. So what are we doing here? The important parts are the ones highlighted in yellow. So we have defs. The defs element in SVG is used to define things, anything that you want to use later, okay, that you want to reference later. Anything that you put inside the defs is not going to be rendered on the screen. So what we're doing here, we're defining a linear gradient. Then at the bottom of the SVG, at the end, we have the text element that contains some kind of text, any text that you want. And then we're using the fill property, which is, I mean, how much more semantic can it get? You have a fill, and then you apply the linear gradient that you defined before as a fill to that text. And you can end up with something like this. And it's not hacky, it's 100% semantic. The text is selectable, searchable, it's accessible, it's perfect. Another example is you can also apply texture text because we also have masks in SVG. Again, inside the defs, we're defining a mask. Inside the mask, you can put anything, a shape, an image, even more. We're going to see examples shortly. And then again, using the text, you apply the mask attribute, you reference a mask and you apply it to text, and you can end up with, again, something like this. Text is 100% semantic. It's also scalable. As you scale, the SVG is going to scale by default. You don't have to do anything. Now, this is where things can get really interesting. Like I said, you can put anything inside a mask. You can put anything, like if you want to apply a fill that's not a linear gradient, that's a pattern, some kind of pattern, you can even apply an animation inside that pattern or just animate the pattern in CSS. And you can end up with these. And the interesting part here is that the first one on the top left, the burn example, uses a GIF. GIF, okay? So it's using a GIF. And you're getting this animated effect without having to do anything, just by referencing that image, okay? And you can create all kinds of examples here. Now, so if you're going to create any kind of textured or graphical text effects, don't use CSS, because browser support for the newer techniques really sucks, and the old techniques just don't use it anymore because you don't have to. You have a better alternative. The best part is SVG text is fully accessible, searchable, selectable, and 100% semantic. Okay. Creative motion effects with filters. We have filters in CSS, right? How many of you have used filters? Probably not in production, maybe because the browser support sucks. Okay, so we have a set of filters, primitive filters in CSS that we can use to apply to HTML or even SVG elements. These are all of the available CSS filters: blur, brightness, contrast. They basically apply, the names are self-explanatory, and you just apply them to any HTML or SVG element. This is good. You can apply multiple filters to an element, get different effects. You can animate these filters. SVG provides us with the same filters, like the CSS filters are a subset of all of the filters that SVG has to offer. Now, not only do we have more filters in SVG, but the most important and most interesting part about SVG is that SVG allows us to take the output, the result of one filter, and use it as an input to another filter. And this is where things can get really interesting. So an example of this is this. So again, we have a defs. Inside it, we have a filter, ID goo. I think you might be. Okay, are you familiar with the goo effect? Yay, I'm going to blow your minds. So we have a filter. Inside the filter element, we have three filter primitives: the FE Gaussian blur, color matrix, and FE composite. So what we're doing here is you have the result attribute in the first filter. We named it blur. You can name it anything you want. And then you use that as an input to the second filter, inside the in attribute, and then the result of the second, you use it as an input for the third, and then you get some effect that is just genius and really beautiful and mind-blowing. The goo effect. So the goo effect can be used. A lot of people it has been making really the rounds lately because it's really amazing, and a lot of people have been using it for creating all kinds of effects. And the chat application is my favorite one, because you see how, these little dots are moving just like there are dots inside the water. And then you have the goo loader and the menu, and then, all of these examples. Okay. This can be done just because you have the ability to pass the result of one filter into another. This is not possible in CSS, but it is possible in SVG. It takes your UI to the next level. Effects like these take your UIs to the next level. Another thing that's possible with SVG filters is motion blur. Something like this. Not possible in CSS. And there's this squiggly text effect. It's really funny. I like it. So again, this one uses the FE turbulence filter. Now, I need to mention that all of these three amazing effects have been created by the same young man, Lucas Beber. You should really keep an eye on his work. This is his CodePen account. He does all kinds of amazing experiments, especially with SVG, and this is his Twitter. If you don't check CodePen too much, he usually tweets only about his experiments, so definitely keep an eye on him. So the best part about SVG filters, I saw a lot of comments on Lucas's article on CodeRups that a lot of people said that the filter is not working in some browser, whatever. The best part is that they're going to fall back perfectly. Like this squiggly text effect, it doesn't work in Firefox, but you're going to get the same text, the same font, the same everything, but it's just not doing that squiggly effect. So it folds back really nicely. All of the filters that you can use them as part of a progressive enhancement, so you don't have any excuse not to start using them. If you're using the goo effect, if it doesn't work in some browser, it's just gonna, if you have a menu, the items are just gonna spread out without that additional goo effect. Okay, so text and motion along arbitrary paths. Again, something we can do in SVG, but we can't do in CSS yet. First thing is text along a path. Now, I don't really know how useful this is. I've never seen anyone use something like this except maybe in logos. But it is possible in SVG, and it is very simple. All you have to do is you define a path, again, inside a defs element, and then you have a text. Inside the text element, use the text path element, where you reference the path that you want, any path it can be any path, and then you put the text inside it, and it's just going to be laid on that path. Very simple, very semantic, and the best part about SVG is that it's, generally speaking, very human readable and easy to learn. You can even animate the text along a path. Now, this does not have any use case. Why would anyone use this unless you're reinventing the marquee in some twisted SVG way? Again, you can use the animate element in SVG and just animate it along the path, but don't do it. Motion along a path in SVG. You can animate elements along arbitrary paths as well. I have a car here who's just going in circles. And again, you have an element. It's called animate motion. You reference any element that you want to move along a path. You give it that path that you want to use, and it just starts animating. There are actually two ways for animating along paths. The first one is to use the animate motion, and the second one is the same thing, but instead of passing the path, okay, where is it? Okay, it's useless. Okay, instead of using the path attribute, you're gonna use the mPath, which is the motion path element inside the animate motion element. So the idea here is just you can animate elements along a path, along arbitrary paths in SVG, but this will be possible in CSS at some point. In September, I think, this specification was created. Basically, the feature that we have in SVG, the ability to move elements along arbitrary paths in SVG has been moved to CSS. We have new CSS properties. I think implementation should have started a few months ago, but I don't know what was holding it back. But we will be able to animate elements along arbitrary paths in CSS too, and that's going to apply to HTML and SVG elements as well. And this is something to look forward to. Icon systems. This is one of the hot topics. It was one of the hot topics during the past year. A lot of people were pro icon fonts. A lot of people were pro SVG icon systems until Chris Coyer wrote this cage match article comparing the two systems to each other. And if you're going to read that article, if you don't use SVG icons, I'm pretty sure you're going to change your mind because SVG icon systems are far more superior than font icons. So some of the advantages of SVG icon systems are they are infinitely scalable and look crisp on all resolutions. Icon fonts don't. They are stylable via CSS. You can apply multiple colors to an icon because it's an SVG image. Icon fonts, you can't do that. Now, I think I remember reading something about a technique where you layer multiple icons and you hide parts of that icon to get that multicolor effect for icon fonts, but I wouldn't do that. It's too much. I mean, why would you want to do that? You have easier size control. If you use M's to size your SVG, it's going to scale up and down with the text. You don't have that with icon fonts. They're interactive and immutable using CSS, SML, or JavaScript. Again, icon fonts don't have that. Semantic markup, icon fonts is all about empty elements. Fully accessible, including text. If you have text, like a letter or something inside an icon, it's going to be accessible. You have many tools to make creation, interaction, embedding, and spriting easier. And now this is what trips a lot of people off and what makes them want to avoid using icon systems. You have so many, like 6 embedding options that you can use to embed your SVGs, and then you have like 3 or 4 spriting techniques that you can use. Which one would you choose? It can get overwhelming, but the thing is, all you have to do is just weigh your options and weigh what you need and with the options that you have, and you get to choose whichever one works for you. Now, there is one spriting technique which is my personal favorite, but it does have some limitations. But again, if we push, we can get rid of those limitations and get those features that we are missing now. You have different embedding techniques, and each embedding technique comes with 1 or more fallback techniques that you can use too. So again, no excuse to not use it. You see, a while back, I think it was during the last week, Bruce, he told me to call him Bruce, Captain Wonderful of Opera, aka Bruce Lawson. Vitaly Friedman from Smashing Magazine, he was asking Bruce about Bruce had tweeted about all the new features that Opera Mini had been getting, like Flexbox support, among many others. So Vitaly asked Bruce whether or not Opera Mini is going to start downloading icon fonts, and I really loved what Bruce replied, the way he just said, "We don't download fonts. Icons are what SVG is for. Don't use icon fonts." Like, a while back, I was in Lebanon, you can get really sucky internet connections. They can get really slow. So I was opening my Twitter account on desktop, and I didn't get any icons. I got those small rectangles that you get. It looks like Twitter devs are still not sold on using SVG Icon Systems, even though they should be. So SVG Icon Systems are just superior. I mean, need I say more? So if you want to start, if I hopefully change your opinion and you want to start using icon systems, SVG Icon Systems, you can get started here. I've written an overview of different spriting techniques on 24ways.org, and Chris Coyer has also written on CSS Tricks, and you can check these out as well. Now, okay, I'm going to take this opportunity. This is not an advertisement or anything. This is a genuine recommendation. I have written about different spriting techniques, but I didn't get really into details in that article. But the Smashing book number 5 is going on, the pre-sale starts in like 4 days from now or less. I really recommend you get it, not because I have written an article in there, but then again, because of that article, if you're interested more in SVG. I still get a lot of questions from people like, okay, I want to start using SVG, but I don't know how, I don't know where to start. The options that I have, it's like they need a complete overview, and so that they know where to start and what to choose. I've written a 23K words chapter. It includes so much more than I could cover in a talk or in articles. Well, I did cover it in an article, but I really recommend it. If you're interested in learning about SVG, that's my best SVG piece that I've written so far. You can check it out. The book is also going to contain loads of practical information about Flexbox, responsive images, etc. So the point is, if you're interested, maybe you want to sign up and save the date and get the book when you can. Accessible data visualization and charts. One common thing is to use HTML5 canvas to create data visualizations and charts. How many of you do that or have done it or have known someone who has? Okay, so people tend to use sometimes HTML5 canvas to create data visualizations and charts. I don't recommend that because the contents of an HTML5 canvas is not accessible. Basically, the content of a canvas is just a bunch of pixels that you're rendering on the canvas. It's not accessible to screen readers. They can't read that content. So this is the number one disadvantage. If you're going to cater for readers or users with disabilities, you're going to have to provide fallback content that would usually go between the opening and closing canvas tags. Okay, but that would still you would still have a problem there, because how would the screen reader know what element on the canvas the user interacted with? There has to be some kind of linking between the two, between the actual content and the fallback content. So the HTML5 Canvas task force added 2 new features, 2 new methods to the HTML5 Canvas specification that takes care of that. But even with that, even with the accessibility being enhanced for HTML5 Canvas, it's still a lot of work. You're using it in modern browsers, but even those modern browsers are going to require a fallback content, and you're going to have to maintain 2 sets of content to provide for users with disabilities. With SVG, you don't have that problem. The contents of the SVG, as we mentioned before, they are accessible by nature. They look great. I remember once seeing an example. Someone created this 3D shape. They created it's an HTML5 canvas and created the exact same thing in SVG, and then scaled both up really high. They scaled it so high. The HTML5 canvas looked pixelated, but SVG did not. So again, a winner. The content is accessible. You don't need to maintain 2 sets of content, and accessibility can even be enhanced more in SVG. SVG has also a set of accessibility features that help you enhance it even more. So if you're going to do any kind of data visualization and charts using SVG, d3.js is the most popular library. So you might want to check it out if you're into this. And also, there are a lot of SVG plugins that allow you to create different patterns that you can use with your charts to make them even better. And then animated diagrams. I really, really love Jake Archibald's work on SVG. He doesn't write about SVG a lot, but he does use SVG a lot. He even tech edited my Smashing Mac chapter. He's brilliant. He knows so much about SVG, and even though he doesn't write, but I got to find that out from working with him. I love how he uses them. He has really practical use cases for SVG. It's not just about icon systems. It's not just about, displaying some pretty image that's going to scale everywhere. He uses them for things like these. This is his offline cookbook. He's using an SVG to create a diagram to illustrate how something works, in this case, service worker. The best part, my favorite part about using SVG for this, I didn't use SVG before, but I started using it recently in my articles. I tend to do a lot of typos, a lot of mistakes. So when I create an image and there's text inside it and there's a typo there, sometimes I might need to have to recreate the same image again because of that misplaced letter or something. With SVG, you don't have to worry about that. You just get into the SVG, change the text, and you're all set. And another advantage here is in this article, Jake has a lot of diagrams, and all of them use SVG, and yet I think it was a really, really small file size that he ended up with, and this is because of the reusability of SVG elements. He had this one SVG where he defined all of these main components, the 5 shapes here, and there are a few others, and he reused them throughout the page. So he got all of the diagrams without all of the bloat, code bloat, and extra HTTP requests. This is an excellent example where SVG can be really useful. Now, to finish up, SVG is great for free-form expression. I'm really hoping for more hands this time. Introverts, raise your hands. What? No hands? Seriously? Okay, there's one. Okay. Oh my God. Okay, so this is going to mean nothing to you, except that you might be able to understand introverts more. This is an animation by Sarah Dresner. It shows one of the real things that you can do with SVG. If you combine all of the ability to animate, to transform, to animate even text, you even have lighting effects in SVG, by the way. So if you combine all of the great features of SVG, you can end up with something like this. Some sound here would have been nice. The silence is... Okay, how else would we be able to create something so nice using a modern technology and don't even think about Flash? How else? So this is great. This is SVG. This is what you can do with SVG. This is why you should be using SVG more. This is why you should, well, you already do. Maybe use it more, build with SVG, and have fun doing it. And thank you so much for listening.